So, welcome to the Love Reading Lit Fest. My name is François von Hurter, publisher at Bitter Lemon Press, and I'm delighted to be talking today to Harriet Crawley, whose new novel, The Translator, is published this week. So, Harriet, if I could start, I'll have some questions to ask you as we spend our time together. And the first one is, how would you describe your novel? How would you even pitch it? But without too many spoilers, could you try and do that?
Yes, certainly, and lovely to be talking to you, Francois. Yes, this is a love story and a thriller combined. I personally prefer the expression suspense fiction, which of course was coined by Patricia Highsmith, but it's drama and two people who are linguists, interpreters, although one of them doesn't like that word, calls himself the translator, find themselves caught up in a huge country-to-country intrigue. Russia is planning to harm the West in a very significant way. And our heroine is the interpreter to the Russian president, who is, in return for a new life, is ready to betray her country and foil this tremendous plot with the help of her former lover and the hero, who is the interpreter stroke translator for the British Prime Minister. So that's the setting for the story.
I think it's magical, and obviously it's very topical, but we'll come back to that. And maybe start off by trying to learn a bit more about you. So could you tell us a bit about your background, where you grew up, what you did in your early career? I know there was a period in politics as well. You might want to touch on that.
Well, yes, both my parents were writers, so that's a very important element, I think, in my life. My mother was a very well-known war correspondent, American, and in fact, her book that was a bestseller in 1941, Looking for Trouble, was reissued by Faber 2 years ago here, so it's in permanent print. She went on to write many histories. My father was a journalist, historian, member of parliament. We were always surrounded by books, and we always, I guess I grew up with a lot of political conversation. So I think I've been linking that to my novel because it comes very naturally to me to want to understand macro politics. Anyway, so that was the background. What was unusual about my education was that whereas my brothers, we all lived in England, my mother never went back to live in America, they went to English public school. I was sent abroad to learn languages to schools where I was the only foreigner. And so I learned French, German in Vienna, and Italian by the time I was 16. And that was very unusual. It was hard work in the schools, but Italy was lovely. Italy was great fun. And so I felt very European by the time I was 17, 18. And I wanted to learn Russian then, but Russia was communist. And my parents pointed out to me that what would I do with it? How would I go there? And this is this terrible business of history repeating itself. Anyway, anyway, I had a career in television. I had some programs on television and I wrote articles. And my first book was not a novel. It was commissioned by Weidenfeld, now I think it's Orion, on the student riots of 1968. Because of my languages, I could go to Paris, Berlin, so on, and talk to people and so on. And this book came out in 1969, I think. I wrote it at 19, it was published at 20. That's the only non-fiction book I've written. And in my mid-20s, I wrote a novel, and then started an art business with my two brothers. And that actually went very well. But I guess I was always thinking maybe I should have a go at politics. And so in my mid-30s, I got a seat in London to fight a general election. It took a lot of effort and time. Anyway, I didn't win, and I got another seat to fight a European election. Didn't win that, but then tragedy had sort of struck in the form that my brothers were killed in an aeroplane crash, and I decided, after my mother mercifully was dead, my father, it was terrible for him, but after he died, I wanted a complete change of scene. And I went to Russia. I was married to a Russian for 2 or 3 years there, but it was the beginning of a 20-year period in Russia. And it was fascinating. And my son Spencer, who I had not married his father, was 7 when I put him into Russian school. So we had a completely different life, which in a way gave me a new lease of life, if you know what I mean. It was so, I was away from all the great friends who loved my brothers and the sadness of it all, and I had a new energy, you know.
But you also had a job in Russia, didn't you, for a long
very
time?
much so, very much
Yeah.
so. I went on with the art business a bit in the form of maps. That was my speciality, old maps. I've always loved maps. And then my Russian husband, Gleb, introduced me to a very famous landscape photographer called Vadim Gippenreiter, German name, but Russian. And I really became his agent. And I sold his beautiful photographs all to the banks and businesses all over Moscow. This was from 94 onwards. The 90s were a period of great hope. And, so anyway, that I was doing that. And it was a very good business.
And then the language, I mean, getting back a bit to our book, but then you speak Russian today. You learned it then. Was it a mountain to climb? Was it rather?
It was
did it come easily?
Agony, absolute agony. I mean, it was so difficult. I was really punished for hubris because I thought, oh, well, it'll be my 4th sort of foreign language, that I must be able to do this. It was so difficult. I mean, it's fair to say that you do not learn in your 40s how you learn it as a teenager. That's point 1. But point 2 is it's such a complicated structure. The grammar is so very difficult. I think Latin helped a bit. Latin always helps. But Russian having 6 cases is only the start.
Yeah.
It is endlessly complicated. Every adjective has different endings in masculine, feminine, neuter. So, they don't match the nouns. And then there's a whole saga about different verbs. You have a different verb. If you say, I am speaking to François now, that's one verb. And if I say I spoke to François yesterday, an entirely different word, because I have completed the action. Now, whoever dreamt this up is, but there you are. You have to get your head around it. Yeah. And I cannot tell you the hours I spent, which is probably why when it came to deciding on characters, I went for the linguist, because I thought there must be some upside to my hours of pain in grappling with this language.
Yeah. Well, that leads us quite naturally then to, how did you get the idea for this book? How did it all start?
Well, I think that was a piece of luck, because I'm not sure. I knew it would be set in Russia. I knew it would not be about me. No expat lady living in Moscow. None of that. I guess it was all part of leaving my past behind. I definitely did not want to write about myself. And I knew that. And then I thought suspense fiction, but what was the state secret, as it were, that my character Marina could sell to the British government that would be of massive importance. What was at stake? And I read lots of things, but nuclear war, it's been done to death. Sort of plutonium or special ghastly chemical weapons. I really couldn't go there. And then in 2017, November, somebody sent me a policy exchange document written by an MP that nobody had heard of. Well, not really heard of, called Rishi Sunak. He had only been an MP for 1.5 years. He got his seat in 2015. Anyway, so he wrote this paper called Undersea Cables.
Yeah.
Indispensable, insecure. And I read it, and it also had quite a big second part written by a former head of the US Navy, who added a lot of information. And I really had not understood that world communications, I thought they were in satellites above us. They're not. They're under the sea. The mass of communication is facilitated through these cables under the sea all over the world. And I didn't realize this. And he is saying in this paper in 2017, the biggest threat to these cables is Russia, because Russia has been dramatically building up its navy. And this is an ongoing process ever since about 2010. They've been spending a lot of money on it, he wrote. And he said, by the way, if these cables are damaged, for example, from the United Kingdom to America, basically our economy would seize up. I mean, that was more or less the gist of this paper, which is now 5.5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
So I thought, crikey, that would be the most dramatic plot. And nobody, to my knowledge, in all the, I don't know, the books that were being published or films and things like that, nobody had touched on that. At least I hadn't come across that. So then it was a question of how to get the experts. And I don't know, they always say there are two types of knowledge. One is you know it yourself, or you know somebody who knows it. I'm very much the second type. I don't think I know anything, but I do know people who know things.
Yeah.
And so I began to ask around, and in a way, my political efforts played a part in this, because I did know people who knew people in politics, and I said, I've got to find experts, and people helped me. One person led me to another person, led me to another, because I realized I was really entering a world about which I knew very little, and therefore I had to get this right. I mean, I had to make it believable to people who really knew the subject.
Yeah.
So I knew it was going to be an awful lot of work, but I thought, again, I was quite excited by it. I thought this will be very interesting.
Were any of these people Russian, or were they all outside Russia?
No, for the cables and all that aspect, and cyber, which plays a much smaller part, but it plays a part, they were not Russian. Invaluable help was by a friend of mine who I thank very much in the acknowledgements, a former Reuters journalist. His help was enormous in what I'd call the detailed background of characters, because of course when you're writing about a character, you're going to probably show, at least this is the way I think about it. I don't know if other people do, but this is how I think about it. You're going to show the tip of the iceberg, but you have to know all the rest. So in other words, you have to know where they did their linguistic studies, what type of teaching they had, if it was in the communist era, what would that have meant? You have to be able to picture their lives. And my characters, this story is set before this dreadful war in Ukraine. So it's set in 2017. And my characters are about 40 and 41. So they had their schooling still in the tail end of the Soviet era, which shaped everybody. I had to be on top of that. Now, I was very familiar with that because of all my years of living in Russia, and I lived with my Russian aunt who grew up in that whole. She sadly has died, but nonetheless, verification. And how was I to get the detail? Well, mercifully, my Russian friend Ilya lives in London and is British actually as well. So he was an immense source of cross-checking, help, again, detail. And I thought, if this detail, it satisfies Ilya, if he feels I have not made mistakes, then I probably haven't, because he had great attention to detail, and that took again a lot of work. And of course, every now and again you get something badly wrong, you have to rewrite everything. So, but I was, I knew what I was doing, trying to do.
Yeah, and on a sort of more superficial level, how are there things in the book that come from personal experiences, places that you visited often, street life that you saw? Are there some very personal things there?
Yes, I think location. Well, I think there are about, yes, three particular things come to mind with your question. Firstly, the character of the older Russian teacher, who is our English translator stroke interpreter's former Russian teacher. She's a lady in her 80s. Now, she was very much modeled on my Aunt Galia. Very sadly, Galia died 3-4 years ago, but that I felt almost as if, I was still with Galia when I wrote about her. So she was absolutely somebody I wanted to recreate. In terms of place, 2 places I've tried to go into great detail. One perhaps a bit less is the dacha that our heroine rents in the countryside just outside Moscow, but the village of Peredyakina was where I lived for 4 years. So, and I saw it transformed from a very charming wooden dacha place with small house, big gardens, almost absurdly big. I mean, we had 117 trees in our garden. Imagine, that's quite big. That village, the atmosphere, the life, all of that, I tried to recreate. That was very personal to me. And then my Moscow flat, which I adored, the last one, I decided that's where our heroine had to live. And I honestly could remember every inch. So I felt I was still there sometimes. But so that also was very, very personal. And I suppose, it's difficult to answer generally because I felt very comfortable writing about Russia because I felt I knew it so well.
So important. Well, to change subjects, why the translator and not the interpreter?
Oh, yes, that's a very good question, François. Very good question. Well, I think it's 2 things. One is that our hero, Clive, is a translator. He translates Chekhov. I mean, the rule of thumb, as I'm sure everybody knows, is you translate the written word and you interpret speech. But firstly, I don't like the word interpreter really, and I felt Clive didn't either, because it implies that you're gonna sort of form your own judgment. And Clive isn't that sort of person. He wants to be very faithful to the person who's speaking in either Russian or English, because he does both. And I didn't feel he wanted to interpret. That's one thing. So I made him not like the word, but also in Russian, there's only one word for this, переводчик, and they put up in front of it audio translator and written translator. Yeah. So in Russian, it's the same word, переводчик, but you have письменный переводчик and then устный переводчик. So, in Russian, it isn't two words. Yeah. But I couldn't have called the novel The Interpreter. It didn't sound right.
Yeah. Then moving to a completely different subject, can you tell us a bit about how you write, how you work? Are you the sort of person that maps everything out chapter by chapter? Or do you get seduced by something a character does and takes you by surprise and takes the book in a different direction? How did you plan everything?
I think my method was rather chaotic, to be honest with you, because I tried to be methodical, and I found planning really far ahead just simply didn't work, because as you just said, characters will do things between point A and B, and usually you should, in my opinion, you should let them do that because it'll sort of make them more real. So I wasted a lot of time trying to plan. I think what I always had very, very clearly in my mind was that these two people, Marina, the Russian interpreter for the Russian president, and Clive, who was the translator interpreter for the British Prime Minister, they were going to meet again in Moscow, rekindle a love affair that had been started 15 years ago at the United Nations. And that was important because this story had to take place very fast. We can come on, if you like, to the marathon, but marathon or no marathon, it was going to take place quickly. It had to be a week or 10 days, no more, to 2 weeks maximum. So they were going to meet again, and she was going to say something dreadful is about to happen, and I can help stop it because I can give you the intelligence. And in return for that, you get me out of Russia. I ought to explain there, which some people find extraordinary, that it's always been the case that if you work in sensitive areas in Russia, you don't have the right to travel. That's been the case always. No, it's not after Perestroika that it stopped. It didn't. The father of a Russian friend of mine works in the aerospace industry, and the only place he's allowed to go is the Paris Air Show. So, my character would not be free to take a holiday in Italy or somewhere. That was not allowed. So anyway, so I knew that this would be the drama, and that somehow she would get this intelligence to the British, but at the same time, she would be in great danger. And the only thing that I knew in the back of my mind is I hate miserable endings. They depress me. If I read a whole book and then the hero dies in a hail of bullets, it's so depressing. So I thought, it's not going to have a miserable ending. We've got to have hope at the ending. Yeah. So that's what I really, in other words, my end was always visible. Yeah. As for the writing, I think you have about 4-hour stretches where you can be really creative. But when that is, I've never really worked out. My gut is that it's always better to crack on in the morning. Yeah. But if for some reason I've missed the morning, I think it's all right. I don't think it's all right late at night for me. And when I'm really sort of underway, my problem is switching off. I mean, it's not a good idea for me to reread something I've written in the evening, because then I never stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then I don't sleep, and then I'm not ready for the next morning. So I tried not to look at anything about 6 or 7 o'clock, stop. I mean, I'm not saying I wrote all day, of course I didn't, but the 4-hour patch would have been between 9 and 6, and maybe a bit of rewriting then, but cut it off at 6 and then look at something else and take your mind off it, because it's terrible when you're going over, but what is that right, and why, maybe that's wrong, and then you're going crazy with it.
Moving to the present then, I know you have friends who are in Moscow. Some have managed to get out, but how is everyone taking this
I think
war and everything that's happening, and what is the danger they face?
Well, I think it's very polarized. I mean, I think the generation of my son, so people in their 30s, everybody who could possibly get out and work for another company in another country has. I saw a big article last week in The Economist that put the exodus at 500,000. Very bright people leaving. Of course, we know lots of young Russian men, over 10,000, went to Georgia to escape being drafted. I think there are so many Russians I know who absolutely hate this war, but if they speak out, they are going to prison. So that it is, the clampdown has been ferocious. Now, at the same time, I know at least one very good friend of mine supports Putin, and her daughter, who now lives in America, gave up trying to speak to her parents about this, because what's very depressing about saying this is that if you want to know what's happening in the world, in Ukraine, really, you can, even now, in for example, Moscow, you can access a VPN, virtual personal network, for free. And through that, you can see CNN, BBC World, I don't know, probably lots of other channels, but you can see the alternative images of these blasted to pieces cities of Ukraine where there's nothing left, and so on and so forth. And but people, I think, don't want to. I mean, it's easier, at least this is the view of a friend of mine called Owen Matthews, who's half Russian. It's easier to go with the massive state propaganda across 4 channels, all 4 stations, giving the impression of diversity, but actually it's the same message over and over and over again. And people, this friend of mine thinks it's a sort of heroic effort to wipe out Nazis in Ukraine. And so there are, of course, Putin has support. There's no question that he has support. But I think it would be wrong to think that there are no Russians in Russia who don't support it, because there are. And there are many, and I suspect they're the younger generation.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. And so not to end on too much pessimism, and it's hard to keep hope up during this war. But let's end, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what you're reading and people who give you comfort.
I'd love to.
And let that be the last question of our interview.
Right, lovely. I'd love to do that. I make a point of not reading too much fiction when I'm writing, because I tend to be like a magpie. I like to steal other people's style, and it all confuses me. but I'd finished the book, writing it, when I read Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, and he was refused 42 times by publishers till he found one, and then he won the Booker Prize. It's one of the best novels I've ever read, and in terms of fiction thrillers, your publishing house, François, Bitter Lemon, has introduced me to some wonderful writers. I think my favorite is Leonardo Padura, and his Havana series. I read 2 of those, but I also loved The Man Who Loved Dogs, because I'm interested in Trotsky and Frida Kahlo and all of that. And I thought that was a tremendous book. It gave such an atmosphere. So that I read not very long ago. And I also like your author who describes Puglia, who was a prosecutor,
Carlos Julio. Carlos Julio.
Carlos Julio, very, very good writer. So those have been great fun for me. They've been a sort of like a present. After when I finished writing, I could actually read a bit more. So that, and the last book I literally just finished, I think is marvelous, called Overreach by Owen Matthews, because I am of course very interested in Ukraine. Overreach, and also Luke Harding Invasion. I have only just started that, so these are not happy books, but I feel I must read them.
Okay, well, Harriet, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words about Little Bitter Lemon. That's very sweet. And thank you for joining me at the Love Reading Lit Fest.
My pleasure, François. Bye-bye.
Bye.